everybody. This is the first of a three-part webinar series entitled Democracy Rebooted, Classic Concepts for Contemporary Times. I'm Nicole Curato. I'm representing the Standing Group for Democratic Innovations, which is one of the three co-hosts of this webinar series. This is very much a labor of love with the PSA's Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Group and the newly founded APSA Democratic Innovations related group. So if you're a member of APSA, we highly encourage you to join the related group, and let's show some love to our American colleagues. I'm sure they really appreciate the support at this very important moment in American politics. The concept of this three-part webinar series is really just to revisit some of the classic concepts in our work on democratic theory and practice. So today we're going to talk about deliberation and protest with no less than Donatella della Porta. 2 weeks from now, we will talk about democratic innovations with Graham Smith. And 4 weeks from now, we will talk about beyond adversary democracy with no other than Jane Mansbridge. And the way we designed this is to organize a conversation between the scholar that put forward this classic concept and have a conversation with an early career academic working on a similar theme. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Donatella della Porta in conversation with Azucena Moran. Azu, over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Nicole. My name is Azucena. I work at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, where I'm doing a PhD on subalternity, parallel spaces of participation, and the counter-public sphere. But I'm even more happy to introduce you to Donatella della Porta, who I think needs little to no introduction to anybody here, especially people in the political science field. Her work is key to understanding social movements and how they interact with democracies. She is Dean of the Social and Political Science faculty at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, where she also leads the Center on Social Movement Studies. Donatella, is really wonderful to have you here. So when I was preparing this, I came up with 1,000 questions I wanted to ask to Donatella, but I had to narrow them down to just a few. So my first question is on deliberation within protests and governmental action. So in your book, Can Democracy Be Saved?, you show us different cases in which protests were organized horizontally and decisions were taken collectively within movements using a deliberative model. You describe this as street politics done by these networks of activists and citizens that somehow showed governments and other communities a new way of organizing, a new possibility of organizing themselves. But beyond showing governments, beyond this performative action, to which point do you think they have actually pushed governments to actually use these approaches to participatory governance? How do you think this deliberation within movements and its capacity to influence governments has changed over time?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And let me say that I'm very honored to participate in these interactions, and that I really appreciated the rule that I didn't have to present a PowerPoint. So I can watch people in the eyes, and they can watch me into my eyes. So I know that the plan is to have a lot of debate, so I will try to address the questions in a short way. And I think that in that book, How Can Democracy Be Saved?, what I wanted to do was to point at the fact that democracy is not just governmental institutions, but is only but it is also social movements, civil societies, and so on. And in this sense, when I address deliberative democracies, I followed on Jane Mansbridge, but also Nancy Fraser's approach, that criticizing the more institutional Habermasen ways of looking at deliberations in institutions, they instead pointed at the importance of deliberations also in civil societies, and also the conflictual dimension. So I think this is reflected in the title of this meeting, Protests and Deliberation in Protest. But I'm a political scientist, so it is not that I want to, can I say, overlook the questions that you have asked about how then prefigurative politics can have an impact on the institutional politics. To the opposite, it is more at the core of my approach and disciplines. And in fact, the book which I just published is a sort of sequel, and it is called How Social Movements Can Save Democracy. And what I try to do there is to see to which extent ideas by recent waves of protest have entered institutions. Because I think that if we look at the 15 de Mayo, Indignados movements, the wave of 2011, what we see is that these movements that were the most critical of institutional politics were nevertheless able to enter institutional politics very quickly, and in some cases very effectively. So what I look at in this new book is exactly the ways in which ideas that have developed within social movements have entered political institutions. And I especially look at three paths. One of them is the referendums from below, so the ways in which several movements have also used instances of direct democracies institutionally put. Blending or bridging direct democracies with deliberative focus. Another one is movement parties that we may address also later on. And the third one, which I think is a very good example today, I say today because we had the results of the referendums in Chile, and it is a sort of crowdsourced constitutionalism or deliberative constitutionalism, which developed with the idea of the social movements in Island, which was the first case, but also have spread. And I think that's the case of Chile with a rewriting of the constitutions pushed for from below is a typical example. But there are also others, and Porto Alegre and participatory budgeting is another example of how ideas from social movements enter into institutions or are blended within institutions. So I think that prefigurations is not separated from institutions. Some social movements organizations prefer to remain within the civil societies, but in successful social movements, there are often some activists that try also to affect more directly the institutions. And this is how I think social movements can save democracy.
Thank you so much, Donatella. I was also very happy to hear, very excited to read the news about Chile this morning. So my second question actually is very related to what you were talking about, in the sense of like what happens with movements, or perhaps like also moving to transnational movements and the hegemony and the possibility of a transnational deliberative process for the movement of movements. You've called this this call for global justice. So there have been very interesting concerns around exclusion and global North hegemony at the local and at the transnational level of these global calls for equality, climate justice, human rights, environmental protection. So for instance, within the feminist movements, there have been local criticisms to the Me Too, to the Ni Una Menos in the United States and in other countries that argue that white-dominated or white-led movements ignore certain intersectionalities of Black, Brown, and Indigenous women's oppression. On the other hand, within movements for racial justice and decolonization, we have intellectuals, sociologists, such as Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who argue against the hegemony of this American and Eurocentric approach to understanding coloniality, domination, racialized identities. Within the environmental movements, you have political scientists, such as Sergio Francos, who talk about the danger of romanticizing and advocating to localize the supply chain in the global north without thinking how that will exacerbate inequalities or what that will mean for the global south. So you have all of these criticisms and contradictions. Do you believe a hegemony of the north exists in these global justice movements? And do you think deliberation and the possibility of collective preference transformation could help address these concerns? How would these global, imagined, feasible deliberation among movements would look like to you?
I think that it is a serious issue that movements are trying to address to a certain extent, trying to repress to another extent. But I think that we were talking about Chile. We know the importance of southern social movement organizations in the World Social Forum. I think that it is a very different types of situations in different transnational networks. So let's take, for instance, climate justice. It is true that for a period, for quite a long time, before the Copenhagen summit, there was a dominance of northern civil societies organizations in the networks that was very much criticized from social movements organizations from the South. And I think that this critique were effective to a large extent in the development of new and alternative type of networks. I don't think one could say the issues is overcome, but it has been addressed. And if we read about the transformations in the climate justice movement, we know that there has been a change that has been produced by the actions of especially new generations of activists and organizations and struggles coming from the South. So the environmentalism of the poor, as it's been called sometimes. Also, I think that it is a very complex situation because the South is also in the North. So what we see in many types of movements and recently with the broad mobilizations on Black Lives Matters and also in the North, we find a lot of criticism and thematizations also in the North of issues of intersectionality, different type of gender, racial, and so on inequalities. And I think this is very important and will continue. Last questions, taking your example, my impression is that at Me Too and Ni Una Menos are very different types of networks. And Ni Una Menos was born in the South. and is addressing issues of violence in a very, horizontal ways, with a lot of networks that have mobilized new generations. And I trust that some of these movements that are emerging now, like the Black Lives Matter movement spreading in Europe, for instance, can help addressing these issues of the connection between also struggles of recognitions and struggles on inequality. Deliberative democracy, or the ideas of creating spaces in which these differences can be analyzed, addressed, discussed, and common identities develop, I think it's of fundamental importance. In different ways, the forums, since the World Social Forums and the local social forums, but also the camps of the anti-austerity protest aimed at this, recognizing that there are different type of inequalities, suffering, identities, and so on, and providing spaces. Prefiguration is also this attempt. Not always successful, because it is different, but I think that there are positive results of some experiments that should be analyzed.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting to hear. My third question goes back to something that you mentioned when you were replying to my first question. That was the whole talk about demobilization and party politics and movements becoming parties. So in your research, you have talked about how global and social justice claims have always somehow occurred in parallel to the need to transform democracy. So when talking about this, you have studied how movements are often hostile to political parties. And quoting you here, these parties are stigmatized as the carriers of an idea of like professional politics. But on the other hand, there are also movements that instead of antagonizing political parties, become political parties themselves, or some iconic leaders from these movements leave these movements to join a political party. And there are several concerns about this. I heard a talk between a very interesting media intellectual called Yasnaya Elena and some Bolivian activists, in which they were talking about this silent demobilization. So that occurred after Evo Morales became president. So movements basically leaving their kind of like grassroots to join the government. So I'm wondering, what effect do these demobilizations have? How does the weakening of movements and spaces can have negative or positive consequences for democracy? And how, on the other hand, hostility, like the actual hostility between movements and parties, could be a good thing for democracy?
Well, I think that there are in movement parties many very different experiences in terms of mobilizing and or demobilizing. So historically, if we think at the development of the communist and socialist parties from the labor movements, we see that the interactions between movement and parties was always very strict, but also with tensions and with continuous re-emergence of movements that tried to bring parties back to their original aims and identities, and tendencies of oligarchizations, bureaucratizations of political parties, which I expect to happen. The Greens parties are an example of this. At the same time, however, I saw historically and in the more recent movements, also sort of a capacity to regenerate and change, given the perceptions that social movements are important for them. So we have very different stories. We have analyzed and compared Syriza and Podemos, and they are to a certain extent similar, but to another extent quite different in their organizations and relationship with social movements. But also the case that you cited of the MAS in Bolivia, which is another of the good news we had from Latin America about a week ago. The fact that notwithstanding the golpist tendency, MAS succeeded in winning the elections, and they did this by mobilizing social movements. There have been very interesting work done on MAS, saying, looking at all the tensions and contradictions, but at the same time, the fact that a political party is an important instrument. In my research on recent party movement parties, the impression I had is that it is not that the parties demobilize the movements, but they emerged in a moment in which activists are already in doubt about the possibilities to continue their struggles and getting results by remaining only in the streets. It was the path, for instance, towards the constructions of Podemos. Clearly, Podemos had an effect of absorbing energies of activists that became party leaders elected in institutions and so on. At the same time, however, I think that electing these activists like Ada Colau in Barcelona, for instance, was not something that just demobilized the movements, but also provided for new resources and so on. And since movements go in wave, we know that they somehow always tend to declines for various reasons that we cannot address now. But I think that the constructions of political parties is one of the trend which often emerges in times of decline of the street politics, but at the same time continue to have a very dialectic interaction. So we see that it happens at several levels, at the local level, at the national level, and I think it is not always the same stories, even if there is similar tendencies, but we have to see specifically how parties evolve. And just to refer to another Latin American case, PT in Brazil was also initially a party born out of movements, then became more institutionalized. Of course, parties then tend to follow a logic within the electoral and the party systems. But I think their importance is not to be underestimated in combination and intentions and in conflict with political parties, with social movements, but also in dialectic interaction.
That's very fascinating. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask one last question before we open to the floor. So many have called 2019 this generation's 1968, and in your publication and the book Sesantotto, you commemorated the 50 years from 1968, since the magic year, by analyzing the heritage it leaves us today and the parallels it had in 2018. That is when you were writing and editing that book. How did it change in 2019 during the hot autumn, and how that has changed in 2020 with this new economic recession, top-down restrictions, and pandemic? How is that? How has that changed, and how can that relate to our democracies?
It is a very important question. My readings of 68 in 2018 was that there was something similar re-emerging with the new cohort or generations of activists that reproduce the type of calls for radical transformations and the global mobilizations of 68. And 2019 was also very interesting in this process because it was the years in which we saw the broad mobilizations of movements. In Italy, 1968 was followed by the so-called long autumn of 2019 because there was large mobilizations in the factories. And I still in the fall of 2019 had the impressions of these strong similarities in the evolutions of the movement. So sparks in 1968 then move into mass mobilizations at global level in 2019. 2020 was, of course, opened with lockdowns everywhere, and the movements in Lebanon, Hong Kong, Chile, and so on were deeply affected by the type of restrictions of the possibility to go in the streets, and movements are streets type of animals. But I think also that it is important in order to understand the fact that mobilizations is ongoing and still massive in many parts of the world. The fact that the pandemic arrived while mobilizations was at the peak. Because what we saw was that after the first developments of strict lockdown, in which several movements were forced to go online, movements have returned in the streets with measures and so on, but also they have developed a lot of instruments to mobilize during the pandemics. And I think that's the type of wave of conflicts, wave of protest that we saw in 2018 and 2019 is not at all over. And it will not be over because the pandemics has pointed at the killing effects of inequalities, have produced the need for rethinking deeply and radically the way in which we conceive the world. So I expect that 2020 and 21 will continue to be part of a wave of protest. And I think the examples that we started with of Chile is a testimony of this. That there was not a break, but a continuity in the mobilizations, and that the effects are will be seen also in the near future.
Thank you for this. I'm very excited after this conversation. I have many more questions, but I'm sure that other people have a lot of questions too. So I think this is a good time to open questions for everybody. You can raise your hand or type something in the chat, and we can continue from there. So I'm going to take two questions now, one by Gianluca and then one by Hans. I don't know, Gianluca, if you want to grab the mic.
Yes. Hello, Donatella. Fascinating. I can't resist the temptation to ask foremost expert on movements about the 5-star movement. Now, 5-star movement, it seems to me that got really at a particular kind of choice between keeping the movement or becoming a party. You could argue it's already a party. And the question is really pretty much as the relationship between the leadership team and the movement base. You got plenty of examples already mentioned. Just got a couple. The Labour Party in this country, in the UK, where I am at the moment. And if you are very successful as the Labour Party when it won in 1998, you had a very strong team, Blair and Gordon, who built on the movement, and it became, or it remained, if you like, or maintained the structure of the party, and was able to be in power for 10 years. In Italy, is a North League, also started as a movement. And you got Salvini actually plays on the tension between a movement and a party. So what about the 5-star movement?
Thank you, Gianluca. I'm going to take Hans' question and then I'm going to let Donatella reply. Hans?
All right. Yeah. So I was going to ask Donatella, in your talk now and in your work in general, you focus a lot on the democratic practices and deliberative practices of social movements. Now, I was wondering if you could also talk maybe a little bit about the democratic ideas. So the ideals, the different ideas, alternative concepts of democracy, those or different social movements pursue and develop in their debates. And then maybe also how these ideas might affect the deliberative and participatory practices within the movement. So how does the theoretical ideas maybe and their practical approaches to democracy interact?
Thank you. Azucena, should I address the question?
Yes, sorry.
Yes. No, thank you for both questions. Starting from the first one, we have studied in this book on movement parties also the 5 stars movement, even if we presented it as a sort of more hybrid type of product than Syriza and Podemos, on which we focused attention upon. Because the 5 stars movement started indeed from local movements, had a huge success that meant also that the development of a political class was, challenged by the quick pace of the success. And what we see now is attempt to innovate from the point of view of especially online democracy. So some ideas have been also similar to the one of the pirate parties in other countries. Podemos has imitated some of them, and I think that the reflections on deliberation online is a relevant one. But at the same time, it was also a party that's to a certain extent developed too quickly without the type of activist with a strong political backgrounds than that Podemos or Syriza could rely upon. And so the party was to a certain extent hijacked and became a party that proclaimed horizontalities but acted in a very vertical ways. Very heterogeneous, because I've met activists of the 5 stars movements that went from activists of the left to typical activists of local committees with little ideological background. So what to expect about the 5 star movements is difficult to say. because it seems that they are not a flash parties, so they still maintain support even if they're not able to successfully perform in local elections and regional elections, but I think are interesting to look at as well, also because they tell us how different movement parties can be. And about these differences, also addressing Anne's questions, I think it is difficult to say that social movements have a conception of democracy. What we found in the Demos project that I found very interesting is that within social movements, you have different conceptions of democracy. So all our organizations, the 250 organizations we studied in this project, declared to be pushing for participatory and deliberative forms of democracy. But the ways in which they conceived participation and deliberation was very different. And this difference was also related to the fact that social movement organizations are often hybrid type of groups that intervene also in other environments. So think about, I don't know, fair trade organizations or social clinics that emerged in Greece, or cooperatives. They all, or unions, rank and file unions. They are all groups that whose conceptions of democracy is also influenced by their traditions and their being embedded besides the social movements arenas, also in other arenas. And the issues like representativity, power inside movements are discussed, but they tend to remain quite different. And I think it is not negative, because it's something that, even if it can become part of splitting and conflicts inside, but it is also something that keep debate on internal democracy alive. And the other things that I think is important, so participations and deliberations, but understood in different ways. And what we saw is also in different moments in time, practiced in different forms. So 2011 and the anti-austerity protests have sort of invented, or I would say more reinvented, the camps as a form of democracy. And they did it by inheriting something of the forums of the global justice movements of 10 years earlier, but also innovating about that. So, for instance, the forums was much more based on associational forms of democracy. The camps was more based on instead direct forms of democracy, bridged with the idea of deliberations and participations. David Graeber has studied also these processes of innovations in the Occupy movements in the United States. And there were also other differences which I think are very relevant when thinking about democracy. For instance, the space of the forums were often spaces that were relevant because the forums was inside them, not because they had an historical importance. If we think about the Indignados, they met in squares that often had a symbolic values, but also they stressed the fact that you need to meet in a public place because the space has to belong to all, which was an idea that was not there in the forums. So what I mean is, it's also interesting to see how ideas developed. And we have not yet studied the 2019-2020 movements, but we know that there have been also attempts to develop ideas of democracy. From the Catalan movements to the movements in Hong Kong, and from Lebanon to Chile, for instance, direct actions has been important and conceived of not only as a forms of protest, but also as a way to open spaces for participation and deliberation. And I think this process of learning from previous movements, but also going beyond them, is interesting in understanding democracy as a process and as an interaction, as a relation.
That is very interesting.
I come back very quickly.
Yes, just very quickly, because we have 3 more questions of other people, please.
I will try to push you a bit about the role of the leadership. I mean, you can't understand the Northern League without Bossi and the passage from Bossi to Salvini, and the same with the 5-star movements. Without Grillo, you can't understand why Conte became twice prime minister, or the alliance with the Democratic Party. And now is the moment of killing the dead, if you like, the father figure, and someone taking the place. So do you see Iglesias, and we can go on and on, always need, at least at the beginning, a strong charismatic leader, or it seems to me empirically that's supported. Sorry to just jump back to...
No worries, Donatella. I'm going to grab the other questions, and then maybe we can come back to Gianluca's. Vidi, I saw that you wrote a question. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to jump in?
Hi. So I had this question. I've been researching social movements in India.
I think we...
Through social movements. Am I audible?
Sorry, Vidi. I think that it paused for a bit, but I think that we can hear you now.
Yeah, so I'll just restate my question. So as part of social movements in India, we had seen that, when the civil society and the government often come to the table to negotiate or to interact, collaborate, there is this genuine danger of the social movement being co-opted. One, all the civil society organization seems to be co-opted. So how do you think such dangers could be warded off if social movements have to appear genuinely deliberative and participatory? Thank you.
Thank you, Vidi. That's a very interesting question. I think that Oliver has a question as well.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Donatella and Azucena. I suppose I'm interested in what do you think, Donatella, are the important research gaps? What do we need to know more about? Where are the areas where we can learn about the interface between participatory and deliberative democracy? And for me, I mean, just as an example, but maybe I've missed something, but it seems to me that we are still there's still a bias in the social movements research community that kind of forgets where a lot of the protest movements are these days, which are the center right and the radical right. Are we doing enough to understand social movements on the right? And could perhaps deliberative scholarship and so paying attention to the communicative dimension of movements on the right and movements on the left tell us something interesting about their visions of democracy and how they work internally as social movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm going to give the mic to Donatella.
Thank you. Starting this time from the last questions, the research gap. Just with the caveat maybe I'm over-optimistic, but I don't think that's the interesting movements at the moment are only on the right. I think there are also dangerous movements on the right, but I think we are in a moment in which the backlash has produced a counter backlash, say so. So Trump is shaking, Salvini is out, at least for the moment, and I think that's a lot of the merits for this in this resistance has been of movements like the feminist movements that have mobilized in Italy against Salvini. Was the first protest which I think was successful and triggered the decline of the Salvini's Lega Nord. Is the protest of the women movements in Verona against the day of the days of the family, the movements for family, which was the right wing neoconservative types of movements. And so I think Black Lives Matter is if Trump loses, would be because of the capacity of this movement to catalyze the opposition to Trump. So I think that this dynamics is at the moment characterized by the emergence of the resistance. But it is true, I think you are right, that we need to study also the radical right, the center right movements in order to understand also differences. Many of these movements have imitated the language and some of the claims of the left-wing movements. And this is not new. Also in the past, the radical right from Nazism and fascism, historically to neo-fascist and neo-Nazism, have tried to take ideas from the progressive movements and use them for regressive type of politics. So I think we need to study them. We have done it in the past with the book on mobilizing on the radical right, in which we saw that it is important not to consider the radical rights as just violent terrorists, but also to understand the ways in which they produce consensus. And other examples of a movement on the right that has imitated movement on progressive movements is the Tea Party movements. And I think it is important to see how these interactions developed. In the research that we have done, we saw that conceptions of democracy are still hugely different. So in the sense that even those radical right groups that pretend to support democracy, take Pegida in Germany, and make claims of sort of referendums, direct democracies and process and so on. They are organized in a very vertical way. They have no aspirations of deliberative democracy. But I think these are things that we have to study, because there is also groups that are much more ambivalent, and for sure social movements are not only progressive. You started asking about research gaps, and I think also some gaps are related with the fact that deliberative democracy as a field of studies has developed quite apart from research on democracy in social movements. While I think that there could be space for more interactions and cross-fertilization, this is happening, but at slow pace and based on the work of some sort of brokers, but still would require much more interactions. And I think that what could be useful in this is developing research projects in which scholars from both backgrounds interact, which is something that we are trying to do, but I think will require time. And the other research gap on the sides of social movement studies is democracy inside movements for a long time has not been thematized. And it is difficult to research empirically. We have used different type of instruments. We have, in the Demos project, we have used interviews with activists, focus groups, and participant observations and surveys and so on. And I think you need them all in order to understand the different characteristics of organizations, individual conceptions, and so on. So I think this is a gap that could be bridged also through the work of your group. And Vinny's questions on cooptations. Yes, I think that there is always this risk, and because it is also in the logic of the development of political parties to move towards electoral competition, and to a certain extent also being occupied by other actors. So take Podemos or take Syriza. There were parties that developed in conflict with PASOK in Greece and with PSOE in Spain. But the more successful they were, the more they also inherited voters and inherited political personnel from the other parties, which to a certain extent helped them to go beyond the narrower basis of the left-wing parties, but on the other hand, introduce also different types of conceptions and more top-down visions, and so more, can I say, attempt to co-opt the movements, and this has created also conflicts within these parties between different leaderships. Go back to the other questions, but I think that we need also there to study more in depth which movements are co-opted in which moment and how movements resist. So MAS that we mentioned before in Bolivia had very different types of relations with different social movements. With the cocaleros and with urban movements, they developed different type of interactions. Cocaleros remained more influence on the parties. There have been split, a lot of criticism, especially with Morales' leadership. But there have been also moments in which Morales was forced to listen more to the social movements. And we will see how things evolve now in a moment in which the parties realize that you need the activists of social movements to resist the right-wing pushes and so on. So this need of mobilizing the actors, the activists, means that parties remain open to changes and pressures and so on. But also what I wanted to point at is it is many movements. Parties are often divided, so we need to understand more in depth. On mass, there is the work of Andrea that has done a lot in order to illuminate the fact that there are sometimes also at the regional level very different types of interactions. So it is not just a matter of being co-opted. There remains relational and arenas space in which social movements can still play a role. And leadership is important. What we saw in movement parties is that movement parties tend to adapt to mainstream party models. So they challenge it, but at the same time, they live within a party systems in which there are some tendencies, some type of political communications that emphasizes the personalizations of political parties, that has been studied also for other political parties. So Tsipras, Iglesias, Morales are Lula for PT are the charismatic leaders that very often are constructed also as a media product for identifications and so on. What we saw in several cases is that these tendencies is also quite dangerous, because these leaders are not the leaders of the past, the charismatic leaders of the past that controlled ideology, apparatuses, and so on, but are to a certain extent quite weak, quite exposed to changes of in their environment and so on. So what we they are exposed to problems of succession so I think analyzing the leaders is important, also seeing the fact that they are to a certain extent mass media product, and that this also means that their support is often shifted. Also the debate in Podemos, when Iglesias bought a house and it opened a wave of criticism inside. Because I think that what we also have is movements that are at the same time very critical of leadership on the left. You, Gianluca, mentioned also the Lega, which I think is also Ilvo Diamanti said a chameleontic type of actors that had very different types of moments in their life. But if we see Salvini, is also typical charismatic leaders, but to a certain extent also weak in the control of the party, and so tendentially ephemerous, since it doesn't have, like Berlusconi did, its own money and business firms that could support him for a long time. But let's see.
Thank you so much, Donatella. We have a couple more minutes. We're going to finish at 1:15. So I think Alice had a question. So maybe I can hand it over to you.
Yes, I did. And then I got interrupted, but I'm happy that you're coming back to me. Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you for the discussion. It's really fascinating insights. I think what raised my curiosity, mainly about your latest book, is the question of referendums, and this connects slightly to Vidi's question. So, coming from Switzerland, we have debates about the extent to which the availability of bottom-up referendums is actually taming the contestatory impulse of social movements. And you've mentioned that they might also have quite a potential into supporting social movements. So I was wondering how we could contrast the Swiss experience, which is still, I think the debate is still open, but with maybe other experiments or actions or practices that you have observed.
Thank you, Alice. Donatella, do you want to jump in right away? I don't know if somebody else has another question. I have one more question, but I don't know if we were going to have time. So I'm just going to hand it over to Donatella before I start talking too much.
Okay, thank you. It's a very important questions about referendums, because we live in an age in which referendums started to become important, even beyond the Swiss examples. And we had referendums like the referendums on Brexit that have produced challenges to democracies, and we had other types of referendums. So when we started to study referendums, our assumptions was like normal elections, you can have referendums of very different qualities besides the outcome of the decisions, but referendums like elections could be more or less deliberative in the campaigns that precedes them, more or less participatory in the process, not only in terms of how many people go to vote, but about how many people participate in the debate before. And in fact, Hans-Peter Krisi, who has studied referendums in Switzerland, also pointed at the fact that referendums are often elite type of instruments. So even if it is not just the plebiscitarian type of referendums in low quality democracies or non-democracies, but they are often controlled by the elite. But this is not always the case. So what we saw is that referendums could be welcoming for challenging actors, because there are moments in which they open arenas for debate and go beyond the traditional party cues that electors use in normal elections. So they are usually called for because political parties either cannot or do not want to decide on some issues, or they are called for by social movements themselves. And we had in mind two processes of referendums that were quite different from each other, but which we considered as interesting from the point of view of referendums that were not elite oriented, but more driven from below. And this was were the referendums against privatization of water in Italy, and the referendums in Scotland and the pseudo-referendum in Catalonia on independence. And what we saw in the water referendums, which was extraordinarily successful for the movements that had launched them, even if the results were then jeopardized in the political process of implementations of the decisions. But what we saw was that these referendums allowed for opening arenas of debates in which different type of associations participated, from Catholic groups to unions and social movements or organizations of different types, but also activists from below. So it was a case in which social medias were used in a very innovative way. Matteo Cernisone studied it, and they studied the fact that online democracy is not just the moment in which you are online, but is also constructed through offline interactions that were very widespread in the water referendum. And the effect of the water referendum was that water became a sort of symbol of the struggle against privatizations of public goods and the commons and so on. And not only the referendums overcome the quorum, so met the quorum, which was something that had not happened in Italy for a long time, the 50 plus 1%, 50% plus 1, but also it was around 95% of the voters that declared they were against privatizations of waters in different ways. I cannot go in details in this. Of course, it doesn't mean that 95% of the voters became suddenly left-wing, but it meant that the debate was important, and scoring a victory was important also for the debate on the commons and so on. The other referendums was Scotland and pseudo-referendum in Catalonia, because it was not accepted by the Spanish authorities. And the idea of studying the Scottish referendums came because a friend and colleague, Michael Keating, who was following the referendum as a scholar of Scottish politics, wrote to me saying, Donatella, you should come and study this because it is a social movement type of process. So even if it was something that had been mobilized by political parties, there was a debate. And the same is true, I think, for Catalonia. So the referendums became arenas in which what was important was not so much the voting moment, but type of debate. And if we look at Ireland, these referendums that unexpectedly produce progressive outcomes on same-sex marriage and abortion, they were also produced through a process of participation. So we didn't want to say that all referendums are, can I say, favorable to deliberative democracy, because the logic of the referendum is a majoritarian one. Direct democracy can be very, say, the opposite of deliberative democracies, more voting than consensus building. But the referendums can also produce arenas for debates. And the other argument was that social movements of a progressive type could improve the qualities of referendums also launched top-down, because they improve the electoral campaign, the referendums campaign, which is the arena in which you can have more deliberation. No, you don't always have more deliberations, but you can in this process. I give a look at the watch, and I think I will have to give back the floor to Azucena. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Donatella. This was a really wonderful conversation. It was very interesting. I have seen also a lot of comments in the chat saying that it was a great way to start the week. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, especially. I mean, right now I'm thinking about della response on how certain institutional designs and certain forms of participation doesn't really mean that using one precludes the other, right? So certain institutional designs can interact with each other. It'll be interesting to see somewhat like this ecosystem of participation rather than just one size fits all kinds of spaces. So it was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to Donatella. It was really an honor. Thank you for the Democratic Innovations groups and to the political science associations. It was a very fascinating conversation. And thank you, Nicole, for organizing this. It was really wonderful.